So, regular listeners to the show may know, or maybe you don't, or maybe you've never noticed, but while you know that this is a progressive political talk show, you may have noticed that we actually don't have a lot of actual politicians on the show very much. We've had some, but certainly not a ton, and frankly, that's actually by choice. The truth is, folks, I don't actually like that many actual politicians. I like some of them. I like Elizabeth Warren. I like Bernie Sanders. I like Keith Ellison. I like some, but I certainly don't like a ton of that. Mostly, the show focuses on activists, the show focuses on journalists, but as you heard today in the introduction of the show, we actually have Shanna Bellows on the show. Shanna is running for Senate in Maine against Susan Collins. She's actually also the former director of the ACLU of Maine. So, I gotta tell you folks, one thing that bothers me as a progressive is that how many Democrats have actually ceded the issue of civil liberties when it comes to issues like NSA spying. And if you're someone who is partisan, who primarily wants to get Democrats elected, frankly, that actually should bother you too. Let me explain why. So, sort of like how Democrats ceded populism following the financial crash and the bailouts, they also have sort of ceded civil liberties on many issues. Like, when Democrats ceded that populism after the crash, they actually helped create the space that gave rise to the Tea Party. And look, we all know the history of the Tea Party. Obviously, they had tons of money from the Koch brothers. They had lots of support from Karl Rove's group and a lot of dark money and astroturfing that was going on. But that space and that anger, that legitimate anger of the financial crash and the bailout that happened after that, well, that anger wasn't funneled into progressive action. It was actually funneled into the Tea Party. And I actually think that, and I've said this before on the show, I actually believe that Democrats are making that same mistake again when it comes to NSA spying and civil liberties. And that is why I'm personally excited to see someone running as a Democrat who is putting NSA spying and civil liberties at the forefront of her campaign. And that, again, is Shanna Bellows. You'll hear it later in the show. I think you'll enjoy the interview. But speaking of the NSA, you might have heard that last week of the internet security problem called Heartbleed. What is Heartbleed exactly? Well, reading from Mother Jones, quote, "On Tuesday, news broke that the safeguard many websites use to protect sensitive information on the internet has a major security flaw for about 2 years. These sites use a security system called OpenSSL to encrypt data like content, passwords, and social security numbers. But thanks to a small coding error in a popular version of OpenSSL, nicknamed Heartbleed, hackers can potentially steal sensitive data from vulnerable websites." End quote. So, this is actually a pretty big problem when it comes to internet security. It supposedly affected most major websites like Google and Yahoo and Facebook. So how bad is it? How bad is this problem? Again, I'm not much of a techie. I'm not really someone who really understands the coding side of things. Luckily, I have a buddy named Steve Stearns who's a progressive, who's also a coder, and he wrote about this. Reading from my buddy Steve Stearns' site, quote, "This is crossing the streams bad. The software that exposed this flaw is in use on a large portion of servers on the internet, and this hole has been there for 2 years before being publicly identified. We have no idea if this exploit was known about by anyone before, so it's entirely possible that it's been maliciously used for some time now. There's evidence to suggest that it has been exploited by some people for the last 6 months or so." End quote. I gotta tell you folks, I love the fact that my buddy Steve Stearns used a Ghostbusters reference. Crossing the streams bad. Steve Stearns is a nerd, which is why he and I are such good friends. Well, so it's not just him. Don't just trust Steve Stearns, but you should. He's a good guy. But also, internet security expert Bruce Schneier, who's been on the show before, said, quote, "On a scale of 1 to 10, this is an 11, end quote. So another nerd reference. This is a Spinal Tap level of internet security. Who would have thought that the coders of the world would be such nerds? Other than everyone who's ever met a coder. But again, so this is horrible. This is a horrible coding flaw here. It puts a vast majority of the internet at risk. And that's bad enough. But the truth is, that's just one side of the story. It's really just the beginning of the story. And Bloomberg News actually had another part of this that is even more disturbing. Reading from Bloomberg News, quote, "The U.S. National Security Agency knew for at least 2 years about a flaw in the way that many websites send sensitive information, now dubbed the Heartbleed bug, and regularly used it to gather critical intelligence." End quote. So, you know what this means, folks? You know what this means? It means that the NSA, the National Security Agency, the NSA that we talk about so much on this show, the NSA, they knew about this flaw and they left Americans' data and bank account information and credit cards. They left all of that vulnerable to not only hackers, but to foreign spying, to identity theft. Not only did they take no action to actually stop it, they themselves exploited the flaw. In fairness, let's be fair to the NSA, in fairness to the NSA, they have denied that fact. But they also denied that they were doing bulk collection, that James Clapper lied to Congress. So I'm sorry, if anyone actually takes the NSA at its word at this point, I'm sorry, you're an idiot. I'm sorry. If you believe them, you're kidding yourselves here. Reading again from Bloomberg, quote, "Putting the Heartbleed bug in its arsenal, the NSA was able to obtain passwords and other basic data that are the building blocks of the sophisticated hacking operations at the core of its mission, but at a cost. Millions of ordinary users were left vulnerable to attack from other nations' intelligence arms and criminal hackers." End quote. And again, what is so crazy about this is that after all of the NSA spying revelations by the whistleblower Edward Snowden, you still had people defending the NSA. You still had generally Obama fans who think that Obama can do no wrong. You had a bunch of people saying, well, unless you have something to hide, you have nothing to worry about when it comes to the NSA. And, obviously I've talked about that before, and I think that's a crazy argument. But it's also not just, in my opinion, crazy. It's also flat out not true. It's not true that there's no harm from this. The NSA knew about this vulnerability. They knew that the entire internet was exposed, including Americans, and they didn't stop it. They used it. They exploited it. That is who we're dealing with here. And again, it just goes to show how many Democrats, going back to what we were starting at the top of the hour here, how Democrats have left themselves exposed politically by defending Obama and the NSA again and again, against, intrusions of privacy, against violations of civil liberties that are, in my opinion, undefendable, but it's also horrible for every single person who uses the internet for business or commerce or anything. So look, if you are still one of the few out there, and there are some who are still defending the NSA and saying that they're great and they're awesome and security and American flags and all that stuff, I have a question. I have a question for you. After this story, after the NSA have left millions of Americans' bank accounts, millions of their email passwords, their credit card info, their social security numbers, after they have left all of that exposed, how can you actually say that you think that they are defending Americans? We'll be right back.